Session, and before we start before we start the session, Manager Penny has an announcement.
I wanted to introduce our new economic development director. I can get the title out. Denise Stevens. Meet the City Council here. Jerry, maybe we can go around the table real quick and introduce yourself.
Jerry, City Council. And Phil Cernanek, District 3, which, Denise, if you've gotten your orientation, you realize is the southeast part of the city.
I'm Jim Taylor. I represent the northwest quadrant of the city, including this area in District 1.
Debbie Brinkman, Mayor, and I represent District 4, which is the southwest quadrant.
Peggy Cole at large. That's everything.
Bruce Beckman at large. Oh. Bruce Stallman at large.
Yeah, we've got all the at-larges over there. Figure that out.
Let's keep it down.
So,
Fine with me.
Denise is in day 2 and still learning the hallways and all, but it's been great having her on board already, and she's jumping in with both feet and no life preservers, so she'll do great. So welcome, Denise. Thanks. Thanks, Mayor.
Well, this evening, we want to welcome John Clark. Thank you, John, for coming down. He is the Neighborhood Resource Coordinator for the City of Longmont within the Community Services Department, and presented at CML this summer. And I think it was Councilmember Beckman, right, and I that were in that particular presentation, and were incredibly impressed, taking fast and furious notes. Clearly didn't catch everything you said, so we wanted you to come to the council and discuss the program that you've established up there, and kind of just give us an overview of the program, and then we'll open it up to questions and discussion with council, if you don't mind.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to be here. Actually, the last time I was here, Sue Wilson, or Payne, was the neighborhood person. So that's been probably 6 or 7 years, I guess.
It's been longer than that.
Has it been longer? Okay. Well, again, I'm John Clark with the City of Longmont, and I just wanted to give a brief overview of what I do and what's in my division, and talk a little bit about our community involvement strategies, and that's really some of what I presented at CML. And then just open it up for discussion and questions. So I came to Longmont about 12 years ago as a neighborhood guy. I was a one-man division, and I worked really to build the capacity of neighborhoods to do what they do best under the kind of concept that city government does certain things well, and like deliver water, provide EMS services, fire, those kinds of things. But there are things, and there's a role that neighbors have that they can do better than government can, and they can do it more effectively and more efficiently, and to try and build their capacity to do that and coordinate with the city so they have a path to be successful. So I worked as a single-man division as a neighborhood guy, basically, for about 5 years. And then we merged with an office called Community Relations, and they had a mediation, conflict resolution program that they did, kind of one-to-one conflict resolution, where I did larger city facilitation and conflict resolution. They also worked on cultural competency. We have a large Latino population, and the staff was Spanish-speaking, and over the 25 years that service has been in existence, they've become a trusted place where Latino folks can come and talk and get services and get direction and that kind of thing. And then about 3 years ago, they brought over code enforcement. The code enforcement, the department that they were in was community development, and they reorganized under economic development and thought that code enforcement didn't fit as well in economic development, and moved it over to community neighborhood resources because of the collaborative approaches that we've been able to do and provide support through mediation, facilitation, and that kind of thing. And what that has accomplished is working with the community relations staff and the folks that do outreach and that have connections with the community, those problems that can be solved in ways that don't necessarily need code enforcement, or the root problem of them is neighbor-to-neighbor disputes or other kinds of things, get referred to us and we resolve them at that level. We still have to deal with code issues, but you know, a lot of times people call the police and call codes because I say they're lobbing grenades over their neighbor's fence at each other, and in some cases haven't talked or don't know their neighbor's name or that kind of thing. And so what we do when that's the root cause of the problem is we try and solve it at that level and create a communication plan and that kind of thing. So now I'm going from the single neighborhood guide to community neighborhood resources. At peak times, I have 15 or 16 people that are staff members that do anything from mediation. We serve as the Fair Housing Office for the City of Longmont. We do trainings for HOAs. We do landlord-tenant training in partnership with the police. We've done leadership training. We register neighborhood groups, and they meet on a monthly basis, and we're averaging 55 people at those meetings on a regular basis. And it's a way for them to learn more about the city, to form relationships. So instead of, again, fighting, they know people and know who to call. And it's more of a partnership, a working relationship, than it is an adversarial relationship. So that's kind of a quick overview of the neighborhood program. We also, through our code enforcement, do graffiti eradication. So we have a 3/4 time person that does nothing but eradicate graffiti. Then the other piece that, and this is more what I presented at CML, is our community involvement strategy. And this started back in 2001 when our city council asked us to look at a way to better engage the community in a community involvement strategy. And we tried a novel approach. Rather than saying this is what we think we should do, we brought in the community and worked with 120 community members and said, how do you want to be involved? What does that look like to you? And they said certain things, and I'll pass these around. This is what came out of that. They said, if something's going on, just tell me about it. If it's going to impact me, then, consult me. If it's really going to impact me in a heavy way that's going to obstruct or change how I live or the services I provide, then involve me. And if it's something that really is not totally government's role, then establish partnerships. And so we looked at that, and there's an organization of facilitation trainers called the International Association of Public Practitioners, IAP2. And they had the structure that we, frankly, co-opted with their permission and created these 4 levels of involvement: inform, consult, involve, and partner. The first 3, the city or city staff is the decision maker. And one of the things that's key about that, I think, is going into a meeting, so a public hearing, what do people expect? A neighborhood meeting, what do they expect to get out of it? They want to change the world. They want to make sure their perspective is heard and maybe implemented. But with the discussion, setting the parameters around who the decision maker is, that conversation changes to, I've got to talk as fast and furious and hard as I can to make my point, to saying, what your role here at this meeting is to provide us with information, the best information that you can, so we can make the best decision and consider that when we're making that decision. So that's the core of our community involvement strategies. These are the 4 levels. These are, on the back, our when and how we use that. On the website URL that I sent you, there's some additional resources. There's a pyramid of these levels and that kind of thing. But we look at this for a lot of things. Medical marijuana was an example. We used the deliberative dialogue approach where we invited caregivers, users, dispensary owners, police, teachers, all in one room and had a conversation about medical marijuana And what we've done through this 11 years of establishing our community involvement strategies is really created a culture of discussion and discovery, and trained staff in different techniques. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, I guess, here with the deliberative dialogue, but we do an annual training for community involvement. We train facilitators. We've had 2 trainings on deliberative dialogue. We've had several mediation trainings for staff. We've done trainings on appreciative inquiry. We've done trainings on graphic recording, so at meetings we can have graphic recorders come in that are city staff members and draw pictures of what's going on and kind of create an image of the facilitation and the involvement activities. And so we use a lot of different kinds of techniques and strategies to engage people and to get information. And another example is our vicious dog meeting. You know, somebody brought forward a concept about banning pit bulls and that kind of thing. And hundreds of people came out, and council was concerned that we're going to be overrun with all these people. It's going to take till midnight. So we had a separate meeting, and we laid the parameters out of what that meeting was for. And the meeting was for to hear their perspectives. We made the promise that everything that they said was going to be conveyed to council. We noted it, dictated it, recorded it, put it in a package to council. Council had an opportunity to review it in advance, and when the public hearing came up, there were 20 people there. It was very manageable. So it was a way to manage that information in a way for people to be heard, and in a way that they felt their opinions were being considered in the decision and that kind of thing. So that's kind of a brief, broad overview of what I do and how we approach things in community and neighborhood resources, and kind of a high-level view of our community involvement strategies as well. Things that are important are perseverance on community involvement. It's taken 11 years. I've been involved in it from the beginning. There has to be a steward of it. One of the important things that's hard to do, frankly, is for city council to really understand it, because council changes hopefully more often than staff does. I don't know if you have term limits and that kind of thing. But using common language. So the common language about, if you as city council say, go out and involve the community, what does that mean? What are you expecting? So we have the common language about, okay, how do you want me to do this? And what kind of level do you want me to do it? And that kind of thing. So having that communication and understanding with staff is also critical. But then having staff that's trained to be able to do this and manage this has saved our city, I think, lots of money. After the CML presentation, I had a consultant came up because I said, we don't use consultants much. We only use them where we really need them. And we don't need them for the basic facilitation, for our outreach and that kind of thing. We need them for specific expertise rather than designing a whole process, because we've gotten to be very good at that. So that's kind of, if there's specific questions you have, but I really wanted to try and keep this open for discussion and to see what kind of questions you might have of me and my approaches and the Longmont's approaches.
Yeah.
One of the last things you talked about was when you had your discussion about pit bulls, and you had a large contingent there, and then the staff put together a pamphlet or notebook to go to council, and you had very few people. Was the reason because this information that was going to council was also made public, and therefore they could read what was being presented to the city council?
Yes, so the reason was, from my perspective, was they really wanted their voice to be heard. And we gave them the opportunity outside that council meeting, made a promise to them that their voice would be heard at council, through the recording, through the transcription, and that kind of thing. So council had that information. And we said, we're not here to decide about pit bulls tonight. That's going to happen later. But give us what's important to you for council to hear, so that they can read that and understand it before the public hearing and that kind of thing. So that's why I feel not many people showed up the night of the public hearing, is because they really felt satisfied that their voice had been heard, was going to be considered in the process.
One of the things we hear a lot is how intimidating it is to come in front of council. So that type of approach, do you think that that brings out more public opinion than if it was just a public hearing?
I think the problem with public hearings is, and I don't know how much time people have, in Longmont it's 3 minutes. I say that people talk as fast and furious and as forceful as they can in that 3 minutes to make their point heard. And in our council, there's not a response. There's not, so they don't know what's happened to that. And that's appropriate at council. I mean, you can't engage in dialogue. So having the dialogue at a different level can help, because it makes them, one of the core values is that I think people want to be heard in their voice and their opinions to be considered in the decision-making process. If they understand, they can understand that you as council, it's your job to make those decisions. But they really want to be heard and know that you heard what they said and are at least considering that in your decision-making process. So we don't do away with public hearings. I mean, but my experience is that they're as fast and furious and loud and forceful as they can be. And the community involvement process can change that conversation. Having, medical marijuana dispensaries and educators and cops in the same room to talk about those issues in a civil way is a way to get to that dialogue. And so we can't do that for every issue, but I think it can help on those things that really that are important and that you want to make sure that people's voices are heard.
Bruce and then Peggy.
How do you, let me ask sort of two questions. How, you go through all this process, and is there any, what's the feedback loop, if any, to your council in terms of, I suppose a lot of this stuff is sort of at a low enough level that it's a staff-driven activity in a normal sense, and therefore maybe doesn't need to, but at some point, there's probably themes that come out or recurring issues that come out of your guys' work. So how do you close the loop to council? And then I wanted to maybe get an example, walk you through an example of one situation, but go ahead and answer that if you don't mind.
Well, it depends on the situation. And I would also say, we don't do a big community involvement process for every little thing that happens.
Right.
We can't do that. But where it makes sense and where the investment up front, provides a benefit in the long term is where I think it's appropriate. So we take that information, and sometimes it's just, it's minutes, it's all the information. It depends on the situation. So sometimes council is looking for an outcome and a balance about the information that was provided. For the medical marijuana deliberative dialogue, we recorded the conversations and provided that to council in minutes. We also, at the end of that, we have a system called Option Power where people use keypads to poll. So after the conversation, better understanding, we had a series of questions that we asked them that we also had a Zoomerang survey on and asked them that. So we conveyed that information to council. And it's rich in really in-depth information about stuff.
Okay. And say for the sake of an argument, you've got a hypothetical neighborhood situation where you've got someone puts up a garage to do some pretty heavy-duty mechanical work on whatever, automobiles or some such thing. Say it complies with the code requirements for purposes of the residential area, but it's loud and there's an awful lot of stuff going on day in and day out, and the neighbors, it's in compliance, but it's not pleasing to the neighborhood. Maybe talk through your process in terms of how you would address the parties, or how would you proceed in a situation like that?
So that's a great example of where code enforcement would refer to our mediation person.
Okay.
We have 25 volunteer mediators. And my staff person is excellent. It's incredible. She calls people out of the blue, says, "Hi, I'm Susan. I'm here to talk to you about your neighbor." She does a wonderful job of having those hard conversations. And mediation is voluntary, and so if people don't want to come to the table, then they don't have to, and we fall back to the codes and enforce them. But we make the attempt to try and form a communication, because typically what comes out of those kinds of things is, look, I've got a right to work in my car, my son's home, whatever, but maybe you could stop at 9 o'clock.
Right.
Start before 7 o'clock, or those kinds of things are the kinds of agreements that come out of the neighbor-to-neighbor disputes. A lot of barking dogs, a lot of fences, trees, those kinds of things. We also do a lot of landlord-tenant issues. But it's really getting people to the table to have those conversations. And the great thing about mediation is that if people are willing to come to the table, they're willing to talk in most cases, because they understand that's what the process is. So if you can get them to the table, you have a good likelihood of being successful in coming out with an agreement.
Peggy?
Yeah, you answered a couple of my questions in response to him, but how many folks do you have in your department then?
Well, I have one mediation specialist that really manages our mediation program. I have one community relations specialist that does the fair housing, cultural competency, and supports cultural and other kinds of conflict resolution, but also supports us in our bilingual support. And then I've got an administrative person. So that's kind of the neighborhood community relations function. I'm still doing most of the neighborhood work, which is getting kind of the short end of the stick right now. We have 3 full-time code inspectors, 2 seasonal code inspectors. We have 2 full-time temporary code inspectors that we hired to move us from a reactive approach in code to a proactive approach. And I can talk more about that. And then we have a half-time code administrative assistant, and we have a 3/4-time graffiti eradication person. And then the executive assistant for our department also sits in my office and supports several departments, but she officially, she's not an official staff person of mine, but does support the administrative staff in our department.
Bill?
John, if you had to say, with all the roles that you have, and where staffing may have been before a more proactive approach was being taken, roughly the same number of people, more, or not? And then I have some follow-ons.
Well, so when the neighborhood service merged with community relations, same number of staff people, but we were both doing conflict resolution, and we all had expertise in that. So why separate those and say, you do the neighbor to neighbor and we do the neighborhood to neighborhood or community facilitation? So really using what I call the matrix approach of taking people's skills and talents and letting them use them where they're effective. In code enforcement, when they gave that to me, I first looked for efficiencies to make us as efficient and effective as we could. Then I went to council and said, we're responding, we're chasing calls. If you want me to move this to a proactive service, I need those two more temporary full-time people. I've had those for 2 years. And we have moved from a 24% proactive, so 76% of our caseload was complaints. In a year and a half to 66% being proactive and 34% being complaints. And the outcomes and having, the other thing is I shifted resources to add that administrative person so that somebody's there to receive the call. Code enforcement do their job out in the field. That's what I pay them to do. But when somebody calls with a complaint, if there's nobody there to answer that, then that adds to the frustration. So looking for somebody that can answer those basic questions, here's what's going on. Is it a code violation? What can I do? And that kind of thing. Having those conversations and paying an administrative person to do that rather than a code officer to do that, where it's appropriate, has helped. The other thing that's happened with that is people are calling in to complain, and we say, well, thanks, ma'am, we already have a case on that, and here's where it is. And so what we're finding is with that additional staff, we're ahead of the game. So people are calling in and complaining, and we already have a case on that because of the proactive work that we're doing. Now, my challenge next year, Council said 2013 is your last year for that extra staff. So I've got to come up with a plan to maintain that. And my theory is that once we get there, it's easier to maintain. My core concepts are people need to understand what the code is, that we expect them to meet the code, that there are consequences if they don't meet it, those three things, and that those folks that physically or financially are unable to meet the code for some reason, we find some resources for them to help bring them into compliance. But without those three things, everybody can have a code violation. I had some pallets laying up next to my house. I was worried somebody was going to. I knew it was there, but I knew that they probably wouldn't, issue a violation unless my neighbor called. So, but the expectation that we expect people to meet the codes, and if they don't, that there's some consequences.
And then, John, you're talking about facilitation and conflict resolution competencies, both in staff and then extended out into volunteer mediators. How long did that take? And as far as your staff, did you recruit those, or did you develop passions and competencies from within?
Well, when I took over community relations, they had a mediation program. And so they had a staff member that was managing that. When that merged with my office, they eliminated the manager, so I was able to hire the mediation specialist. And she was one of our volunteer mediators. She's also a lawyer that doesn't practice law for us, but understands the law, and has a number of different, hit her on a number of certifications that she has. But she's the one that makes those cold calls and manages our 25 volunteer mediators. Some of those mediators are lawyers, are retired lawyers. Some own bed and breakfast. We have mediators at the eviction hearings at the Boulder County courtroom in Longmont every Friday morning for eviction hearings. So we have 25 volunteer mediators that we use. And with our mediation training, we've been able to train. So I've had all my code staff go to mediation training, even though we don't use them as volunteer mediators. One of our council members attended our mediation training, and is now one of our volunteer mediators. So people that are passionate about conflict resolution really are jazzed about exciting things, and about having these conversations and facilitating an agreement.
Magic phrase, where appropriate. How does that get determined? And it sounds a little magical.
Well, where do we mediate?
Well, you're talking about things getting directed, sent in particular directions. Does it go here, there, elsewhere? Which is the area of specialty that it goes? And at least what I heard was we do what's appropriate. Who's determining what's appropriate, and maybe explain a little bit of I'll refer to it as the magic behind some of that.
Well, a couple things. So the routine things just happen. But I think I have excellent staff that make good choices, and I encourage them and allow them to do that. And tell them that if they need further direction, to ask me. But they don't need to come to me, or there's not a process where code enforcement may go out and there's this issue. My hope is, and I think the reality is, that they know and have the relationship with other staff members to make that decision and to do it themselves. So there's another thing that we do for those really gnarly things. And an example of that is our substandard housing team. So we follow up on credible interior complaints. We find things that we don't like to find inside houses. And we've put together a substandard housing team that is code enforcement, utility building, adult protective services, senior services, youth services, Boulder County Health, and police department. So it's a team that comes together to make, where there's really, really difficult decisions about actually condemning a house or something like that, rather than having my code staff make that decision. And sometimes they make it because it's very clear. But if there's a hoarding situation or something like that, where we actually have a mental health staff on retainer, and in certain situations, they go into the house with code enforcement, with animal control, in initial inspection, to really look at the holistic approach to deal with those really gnarly problems. When we started really doing that, we decreased the compliance time for those really hard substandard housing cases by 52%. So we were able to remedy those sooner. But we have a therapist on staff to help support that. Not in a big way, but 2 or 3, maybe 4 sessions and that kind of thing. So that team does a couple things. It provides a broad level of expertise from those different services and brings their perspectives, enforcement, and other kinds of concepts. But it also supports staff in making decisions. When they're the ones that are taking somebody's house, closing it, then they have a better feeling like they've exhausted all the possibilities and have discussed it with this team, and that team helps make the decision. So I would say, I like to think I empower my staff to make those decisions on an everyday basis, and we provide this team approach that's broader for those really gnarly things.
And you started and you said one of the things that's required is I'm assuming it's not one of those things where someone came in with a little bit of fairy dust and said, here's what we're going to do. It took some time and some evolution and folks willing to change kind of approaches. Talk about that incarnation part of getting to where you are now.
Well, the interesting, and maybe not so interesting, but the thing is that frontline staff were more eager to come to the table because they saw the value in it and experienced it. An example is adult protective services in Boulder County. A lot of these substandard housing cases have to do with mental health issues, elderly, other kinds of things. And up until just recently, the supervisors were not involved. And recently they are. So basically what has happened is this team has formed, and it's really keeping it going, forming those relationships, giving them the power. So to let them go outside of their job. So when Boulder County Health calls, they do the inspections and the determination if something is doesn't meet the health standards, but they don't have the enforcement ability to do something about it. We do. So when they call, we come. When we call, they come. So it's been a support network that we've been able to build, but you have to give people the freedom to respond that way and not say, look, that's not quite your job description, but it's support, but looking at supporting the overall outcomes and that kind of thing. But then what has happened over the last several years is that this team has gotten a reputation of getting things done. And so people want to be a part of it now. They want to be part of the culture. And so through the results that we've had, people want to be a part of the team, and the team is growing and becoming stronger because of that. So the perseverance is talking about the strategies, giving the people the authority to do it, convincing somebody, another supervisor, to allow them to do it, letting them do the good work, and then people tend to gravitate towards it. That's what
Jim?
You tell me how your department dovetails with the Housing Authority in Longmont.
So we're in the same office with our CDBG Affordable Housing Program, and we partner with them a lot. We have a neighborhood revitalization strategy. That's a staff member I forgot to talk about. I've got a half-time neighborhood revitalization staff person. So council dedicated a third of the CDBG money that we get towards neighborhood revitalization. And so we work very closely with that department and use their emergency grants for these things that we don't want to discover for code enforcement, that people that qualify and that kind of thing. That's separate from the Housing Authority. In Longmont, we have an independent housing authority, and we do partner with them. In fact, two of their staff are trained mediators and are part of our volunteer team, and we work with them on a number of different kinds of issues. But through our CDBG Community Development Block Grant funding and our affordable housing program, we partner a lot, are in the same office, have the same kind of relationship around supporting each other that we do with staff that I directly oversee.
Do you mind sharing how much CBDG money you get, and are you a direct grantee?
I'm not sure the terms of CDBG. So I get, it's been anywhere between $130,000 and $140,000 typically to support neighborhood revitalization. So our council asked us to look at specific revitalization. What we do is go in, ask a neighborhood what they like about their neighborhood, want to preserve and enhance and keep, what they think is bringing the neighborhood down and want to change for the better. And we work and create a strategic plan with those. Those are on the city's website if you look for revitalization, and then work at implementing it. We partner with our power department to put lights in, our police department for neighborhood watch. We have a crime-free multi-housing program that is focused in our revitalization area. So it's identifying this area that, in Longmont's a good city, it doesn't have really bad areas, but looking at those areas that may be going the wrong way and trying to turn them around and focusing not just neighborhood resources there, but other kinds of resources as well. In fact, we were talking about faith organizations. A couple years ago, we had a church come in, bring in 500 volunteers, and we did a neighborhood cleanup, alley cleanup, had a party in the park afterwards, and served 500 people hot dogs and hamburgers.
John, would you talk about you mentioned it earlier, the neighborhood groups and how you start getting those put together and how you're literally extracting leaders out of those groups?
So the city back in the city of Longmont back in the 80s started registering neighborhood groups, and it was largely around development issues. So we were growing so fast, this neighborhood was going to be built next to my neighborhood, and I wanted to know more about it. So they registered with the city so we could contact them and talk to them. But what we offer, and which I think is important, is a series of is support. So we offer activity grants. I've got $8,000 in neighborhood activity grants. So depending on the size of the neighborhood, you can get anywhere from $100 to $400 to have a neighborhood event. A party something that brings people together. Through our public improvement fund, we offer $50,000 in neighborhood improvement grants. Neighborhood identity, tree planting, but it's really a way for neighbors to get together and make those decisions to spend some of their tax dollars in ways that they really want. That's needs to fit the parameters of those funds, certainly, but those, we're in that process right now, from anything from community gardens, neighborhood identity signs, trees, irrigation. The irrigation has been a big issue because of the HOAs were built 15 years ago, and their irrigation systems aren't really functional today. So those kinds of things. So that's how we support neighborhoods financially. And then I also have some money for block party money. And that's a program called Discover Neighbors, Discover Home. And so if you map out your block, get people's names, addresses, if their kids do yard work or what their dog's name is, that kind of thing, map that out, bring it in, we'll make copies, you take it back to your neighbors and share it. So instead of saying, hey, you at least know somebody's name. You come home, 10 o'clock at night, somebody's garage door is open, you can call them. You know, it starts that relationship. So we'll give $50 or $100 to anybody that will map out 6 or 12 homes on their block to have a block level event. Because when something goes wrong, if somebody falls and breaks their hip, it's those, and this is the example of what neighbors do best, you know. If somebody falls and breaks their hip and can't mow the lawn, they've got a couple choices. They can all pitch in and do it, or they can call code enforcement. You know, we'll make them do it. We'll find a way to make them do it. What's the best way? And the reality is, you know, we're better off as a government if they can do that. They're better at doing those kinds of things. And then we have these monthly meetings where we provide, every January I sit down with the neighborhood group leaders and I say, what do you want to hear about this year? What's important to you? And again, using those community involvement strategies rather than me sitting in my office trying to decide what's best for them, saying, what do you want to hear about? And we break into small groups, use a sticky wall, and set some priorities and parameters, and program the entire year's worth of meetings. And so that changes from year to year. There's, you know, economic development, code enforcement always comes up, and that kind of thing. But there's other kinds of things, fair housing, and other, you know, a number of things that come up. But we let them choose those meetings, so that provides the buy-in. Invite city staff or other speakers to come in and talk. That helps provide the relationships and understanding. You know, last spring when we had the big snow and everybody had limbs down, you know, there's one of the neighbors got up and was complaining about how the city was slow in responding. And 3 people got up and said, what's wrong with you? You know, we're all in this boat together. They're doing the best they can. So it was a small but great example of how through that program, people understood the dynamics of city government better and actually defended city staff in a way that was, I think, that felt good for me and the other staff members that were there. So having those neighborhood leader meetings, have them choose what the topic is and really set the agenda, meeting staff, networking, HOAs sharing information, volunteer neighborhoods sharing information, and really, so it provides a whole level of opportunities. The grants, I think, are important because what brings people to the table if there's not a conflict or a crisis in a neighborhood? And these grants, these little grants, you know, I see these $50 neighborhood block party grants, and people go out and spend $500 on something. But there's just a little seed. There's a path that you can create, you know, through having some resources. We don't charge them for barricades. They can go down to Public Works and have barricades free. We don't charge them for your registered neighbor group. We don't charge you for permits for those kinds of things and that kind of thing. So we try and make it easy and support them in that kind of work.
I'm just absolutely amazed that you can get that many people at these meetings on a consistent basis. It intrigues me.
Well, our Landlord Training Alliance that we partnered with the police department. So what we found through our mediation program, a lot of these landlord-tenant issues were things that came up. So we did the same thing with that. We're getting 40 and 50 landlords at these meetings. We've had over 140, close to 150 landlords, individual landlords that have come to our landlord training. And looking at the units that they represent, it represents about 5,000 rental units in Longmont. So these are people that, again, are learning about the law so that if they have to fix somebody, they know how to do it. If they understand the fair housing laws, they're working with police on the crime issues. And so it's really providing them with good information. And that's growing as well, our Landlord Training Alliance.
Bruce?
John, I was really impressed when I heard you up at CML, and again, I'm impressed with everything that you're doing. It's quite a program. Just a couple questions. You had mentioned up at the CML that your neighborhood groups were not designed the same way, the boundaries weren't the same, and the leaders were not the same as Neighborhood Watch, that they were just different operations. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the other question I had was, when you when you find yourself unsuccessful with the mediation and all those different things, and you do resort to having to issue a summons for a violation, how has this impacted your court system as you have become from reactive to proactive and increased your involvement out there? Has there been a requirement to increase court staff or to change some kind of process in courts? And was there a need for different ordinances in order to be more effective?
No, it hasn't really impacted our courts. You know, what I find is in the proactive approach is that the vast majority of the people want to do the right thing. And so if I got a notice of violation, I would be mortified, and I would run right out and take care of it. And that's how most people are, especially if they know that we're going to follow up on it. So the proactive work is catching those people that, dealing with the thing to bring the whole neighborhood up. It really hasn't increased dramatically the summonses or the number of cases that we've taken to court. It just has dealt in a different way with those complaints. So our court and our city court is not so busy. We've talked to them about mediation, and they don't really want to be involved in mediation. They said that, frankly, they don't need it at this point, that they aren't overburdened with their caseload.
It would seem to me to reflect the kind of philosophy that you have, that if I had violated one of the ordinances and I ended up in court, for me to be able to say to the judge, I have corrected the problem and it doesn't exist anymore, in the philosophy that you have, that sounds to me like the case would be dismissed, I wouldn't be fined. And I think that would probably be a very positive approach. Does the court buy into that also?
No. When it goes to court, that's one of the values of mediation. What we say is, you making the decision. Once it goes to court,
no more. Okay.
You've given up that power. It's in somebody else's, in somebody else's ballpark.
So this is your negotiation. This is your mediation. The court's going to deal with what the court's going to do.
Right. But keep in mind, we had over 5,000 code enforcement cases last year. So the vast majority of those come into compliance on their own. And what I find is that with the proactive approach is that, again, under the concept that most people want to do the right thing, if they know what the code is, know that we expect them to meet it and that there's consequences, most people will comply. And what it allows me to do is the code staff can really focus more on those really hard cases that need attention. And because the proactive ones tend to be resolved more easily and more quickly.
I want to just mention that we do have our code staff here. And if you have any questions, there's a mic by Kirsten. So just come up and sit by the mic if you have a question, please. Phil.
I want to go back to one of the questions Bruce mentioned that I didn't hear the answer for, John, which is, you've gotten to where you are. What was needed as far as code, regulation, laws, or was it more process and practice?
Process and practice. So let me give you an example. When I took over graffiti eradication, code enforcement used to open a case for graffiti eradication. So we'd get a complaint, go out and inspect it, open a case, send it to the graffiti eradication guy. He would go out, we'd get an authorization to remove it. He'd go out and remove it, let us know, we'd close the case. We're doing a lot of casework here. What we really want to do is eradicate graffiti. So what we do now is we refer it to him, he goes out, takes a picture of it, and gives it to our police department so they can track the gang activity, eradicates it, we're done. So we didn't change any ordinances, we just changed how we tracked it. And so we have cameras with GPS, we upload them to the website, police can look at geographic references and things like that. And so just looking at those common sense approaches about what we're really trying to accomplish is to eradicate graffiti as quickly as possible. And how are our policies and practices interfering with that? So we always look at, right now we're looking at our noise ordinances, We're looking at our tree ordinance, and so we are looking at ordinances to try and make them better and easier to enforce and clearer to enforce. But we really have not wholesalely changed our ordinances. Most of our ordinances, the ultimate resolution is summons and court date. And I think eventually we need to look at that because, the reality is if somebody doesn't remove the snow and ice on their walk, by the time it gets to court, it's May or June, and that really makes sense. So we are looking at how we approach that, and should just a ticket be a better approach? But we haven't wholesalely changed our codes. It's just in how we've looked at it and asked them to proactively identify those kinds of things. And do that in a way that is not picking on people. So you go out to a neighborhood, you look, and you scan. You don't just do one house.
Peggy?
So what is your total budget, for your program?
Total budget for all my stuff is about $180,000, I think. I'd have to take a look at that.
For all your employees?
Well, no, I'm sorry, that's not right. That's just for the community relations. It's about $800,000, including code. I'd have to look. That's, and I could, if you wanted, I could give you a list of the FTEs and the cost of things.
Maybe send it to Michael or.
Okay. In my budget is largely staff. What's not staff are the neighborhood improvement grants, $50,000. There's about $15,000 in activity, neighborhood activity, and Discover Neighbor grants, and then about probably another $5,000 or $10,000 for outreach for the Landlord Training Alliance, just to support those kinds of things and that kind of thing. But we don't typically pay presenters and that kind of thing. So my budget is primarily staff.
Okay, Bruce, and then Jim.
Out of the, well, you said 800,000. How does that contrast with the total general fund?
I don't know. Is my best answer. I can get you those figures.
More just trying to scale. Just curious, ballpark kind of number.
He can send it when he.
Yeah,
It's fine.
I can say that. Okay.
Jim?
John, how are you?
Oh, good.
Good. There's a couple problems that code enforcement always has. And one of those, and I'm interested about your mediation program. We do have mediators that we pay. But a lot of times, Longmont, just like Littleton, gets right in the middle between neighborhood disputes. And what we hear is, I'm not going to go talk to him because I don't like him, and back and forth. How do you get him to the table?
Well, I would say that goes back to my staff member that really does a great job of that cold call and having a conversation about, don't you want to change how you live next to your neighbor? This conflict has been going on so long. There are ways that we can help support a change in that because people get tired of it, and not everybody does. So we don't make that change every time. But it's really having that conversation about living a different lifestyle and providing some resources to do that. And having our volunteer mediators that are not city staff helps a lot because they're independent. It's not a city person coming telling you what to do.
Yeah, because it gets where that one neighbor calls on another, then they call on him, and it goes back and forth, and it lasts for years.
So those are the kind of things I really encourage my code officers to call our mediation folks about, because those are the things that are, there could be legitimate code violations, but the actions, the calls we're getting are because of the neighbor-neighbor dispute, not because of the code violation. There's an example recently that a neighbor called about somebody built a new shed in their backyard. Thought it was illegal. Well, it was. But we went out and looked at it. Well, guess what? The neighbor that called also had an illegal shed. Yeah. So we mediated that. They decided, no foul, no harm, everybody go home. And so code enforcement said, okay, this is not something we proactively look at. We're not looking at that level of stuff. We're looking at things that really impact our community at a greater level. So we didn't issue any violations on that. You know, one other thing we did is we polled the city about, we polled our neighbors and our residents about the kinds of things that were most important to them in code enforcement. What were the things that they felt had the most impact on the quality of their life? And so our proactive approaches are focusing on that. You know, my code staff would say, well, John, I could have told you that, and it is because they match our most common calls. But again, asking people about that helps say to council, you know, look, this is what we heard. It's not only what we know, but other people told us this as well.
My other question is, we have homeowners that get started, say they're going to re-side their house or something like that, or they're going to do this, put an addition on. And either because of expertise or more than likely money, those projects come to an end. When you talked about the funds that you get from the CBG funds, is any of that money, how do you help those homeowners get over the hurdle? Is that a use for that money, or is that strictly neighborhood enhancement money that would benefit everybody?
So the CDBG money that's dedicated for me towards neighborhood revitalization has to have a neighborhood benefit.
Okay.
So it has to be something. Now, if a neighborhood decides that chain link fences in the front yard are a problem, we want to give grants to change those out to picket fences. We've had neighborhoods that have done that and used the CDBG money for that. But the CDBG money for neighborhood revitalization is focused on a neighborhood benefit. But our CDBG office also offers emergency grants up to $2,500 for people that income qualify, for fix a furnace or hot water heater, that kind of thing. And we can offer up to $25,000 for rehab. So those kinds of things where people legitimately can't financially or physically do things, we can connect them with either a grant or a low-interest loan or that kind of thing. So working, you know, the other thing is working closely with our CDBG folks is our code officers can be ambassadors for that kind of thing. And, you know, there's nothing worse than, and I know you've heard the story, you knock on the door and somebody has a code violation. They said, well, you know, I've got cancer, my wife died, my home's in foreclosure. What are you going to do for me, you know? And meanwhile, there's a major violation that you got to do something with. Having resources, having connections to help support that, though if a house is going to go into foreclosure, we may make those kind of decisions. But having resources to help the code officers fix those problems, I think is one of the keys. It's one of those three things about education, expectations and enforcement, but the fourth is finding some resources, whether it's faith organizations that we talked about to support those kinds of things, but finding some resources for those folks that fall through the cracks, because when you do proactive enforcement, as you know, you're going to find things that you don't want to find. And we're looking under the rocks. We need to figure out a way to help support those folks as well. That's my philosophy. The last 3 years, council has given us an additional $10,000 to support those kinds of efforts. This year that didn't happen because of the budget considerations. But we still have those strong relationships with CDBG.
Thanks, Sue. Thank you. Phil?
John, how do you interface with HOAs in those places where an HOA may be defunct?
Well, you know, there are two things that are happening in Longmont. One is the primary one where the HOAs are defunct is when they don't have any real property or that kind of thing. I live in a neighborhood like that where the neighborhood was developed as an HOA. The deed restrictions were mostly design review, you have to have a certain amount of stone or that kind of thing, but it had no common property. And a lot of those have gone away. And there's nothing, basically they fall back to the city codes for enforcement. So we don't deal with those. In the late 80s, our council said that every new development had to have 10% open space. And so every new HOA above a certain number, and I forget what that number is, has open space that they have to maintain. And so they have real property that they have to maintain. And I've heard in some other cities around the country that even those HOAs are going defunct. We haven't had that issue in Longmont. I don't know, I'm not quite sure what we'd do if we did, but we say, you're responsible for it.
Now, with your proactive enforcement and also mediation, rehabilitation, the whole gamut, HOAs kind of have an interest level. How do you interface? Do you bypass? Do you work with the HOA boards where one may be active or not?
So 2/3 of our registered neighborhoods are HOAs. Of our about 55 or 60 registered neighborhoods. When I first came to Longmont, it was mostly voluntary neighborhoods. But HOAs have found that these neighborhood improvement grants really help support a lot of the things that they want to do, especially with irrigation systems, neighborhood identity, and that kind of thing. So they've really come on board, and the smart property managers have encouraged them to do that. So that's happening. We do specific HOA training. So this coming Thursday, we're having a training on the new laws and that kind of thing. So we have anywhere from 3 to 5 HOA-specific trainings outside the neighborhood group leader meetings to help support that. We help give them some of the tools that they need. If there are, we've had our mediators or my staff attend some contentious HOA meetings where people say, well, I can't trust the vote to happen and that kind of thing. So we've actually helped facilitate those kinds of things. Right. And if there's neighbor-to-neighbor disputes, we will mediate them. We don't get involved. It's clear from a code perspective where our city codes stop and where the HOA covenants start, and really don't get involved at that level. We do get a lot of calls about HOAs not acting right, and we'll facilitate a conversation, provide information. But the state has a new HOA officer that takes complaints, and we refer folks to that because we really can't. The HOAs are state governed for them. At least in Longmont. So we refer them to the state. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
John, on your website, you've got some information on what you do, what your council does for outreach, and with the consultants that specifically speak with council members, coffee with council last Saturday of the month, town meetings, and then I know that you've done a lot of different you've got informational resources, you utilize a lot of different ways. Could you talk a little bit about those outreach programs?
So those outreach programs are really managed out of our city manager's office. So I'm not as engaged in them. Often after a council with coffee, I'll get a code complaint or something like that. But if it's a conflict that needs to be resolved, it typically comes to us. If there's facilitation that needs to happen, it typically comes to us. We help support those kinds of meetings, but they're really run by our city manager's office and city council. One of the things our city council does once or twice a year is have an open forum. I don't know if you've ever looked at that, but instead of having a regular council meeting, people come and instead of public mind to be heard, council responds and you have a dialogue. That a lot of people come out for that. But that's kind of the point of the coffees with council and that kind of thing. But those can also turn out to be, the people that are chronic complainers and aren't getting what they want can get the ear of council, and when those come back to me, I know about them, and, we'll follow up as I need to. But typically, if they're chronic complainers, they've already called everybody anyway, and we're dealing with them,
Bruce?
I can't recall whether it was you or the other presenter who talked about each council district having their top 5 or top 10 project homes or areas for code enforcement. Was that something you all did?
No.
That was the other speaker. Okay. My question is from just a concurrent type effect. Do you find that from a crime analysis point of view that the safer communities are the communities that you're spending this time in, and that there's a correlation between cleaning it up and making it more appropriate to the code, that it creates a higher level of perception of safety and less crime occurs?
Yes, and somewhat. So I think the perception of safety goes up. So if there's less chronic code violations, people feel more at home and more comfortable, certainly the perception of crime goes up. Our neighborhood revitalization has a very high level of perception of crime. The reality doesn't meet that perception. And neighbors, getting to know each other, working together, partnering with police, adding things that lights and other kinds of things that have to do with their sense of crime, providing an easier interface to access police, so at those revitalization meeting, police officers are there, answer questions, form that relationship, hear what's going on, can address those concerns that may not be real, but also hear those concerns that are real and act on them in a proactive way. In some cases, I've run crime stats afterwards, and they have changed. But the perception of crime has also gone down. One of the other gauges that we use is, and I mentioned this at CML, is the Sense of Community Index. So there's a 24-item quiz that gauges someone's sense of community. And there's 4 elements of that, and I do a pre and post survey of that, and we're going to be looking at that citywide as well. So if the people feel connected with their neighbors in the city is something else we measure. I don't have any hard facts on the change in crime, but I could get those. Certainly the perception of crime goes down with the revitalization efforts in neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Peggy?
So if you had more money, what one thing would you do?
I don't need more money.
Whoa.
I mean, I think I think our city council is really funded as well. I think the one thing that's going away for next year is that $10,000 pot of money that is very flexible to help support those things that we find. And I guess one other thing is when I talk about the journey I've gone in Longmont from 12 years ago being the neighborhood guy and now managing these folks and not having additional resources outside the revitalization area to support neighborhoods. The resources dedicated towards proactively encouraging neighborhoods to form has gone down. I think we have a great system that has been easy for me to maintain, and I've been maintaining it with about 15% of my time, where 12 years ago it was 100% of my time. So I guess the other thing I would look at is spending time to do outreach and tell the story about the value of active neighborhoods and the benefit that they can change. I mean, just a simple story about knowing your neighbor when you go away. Can they check on your cat? If the newspaper is still being delivered, will they bring it in? Will they bring in your trash can? Those little things create such a sense of peace of mind And it's a simple thing that neighbors can do for each other. So doing that proactive work to encouraging that, I think people have it, most people have it in their heart and their soul to want to do these kinds of things. But to do the work to try and encourage and foster that and honor it and tell those stories, I think. So I guess I would say two things, that little pot of money to help support those folks that really need it, and some additional resources to grow the neighborhood effort, which has been diminished.
And then, John, on that sense of community index, is that done by survey, or is that an individual questionnaire? Is that something you use with your volunteers? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It was created by an organization called Community Science. It used to be a 12-question survey, now it's 24. They updated it to make it more valid. It's been tested internationally. The 4 factors are shared emotional connection. I know I'm going to miss them here. Fulfillment of needs. Well, I can't think of them. But it measures 4 elements of people feeling connected with their neighbors, with their community. Influence, so how do I influence my community, how they influence me. It's open source. You can use it if you do a Google search for Community Science Sense of Community Index 2, you'll find it. In my neighborhood revitalization, we do that as a post-survey, and the increase in the general neighborhood in their sense of community goes up by about 30 or 40%. And the increase of the core group that's really involved, those neighbors that interact with us, often goes up 100, 150, sometimes 200%. So the folks that are really engaged, their sense of community, so they feel like they're making a difference. They feel like they're influencing us, we influence them, the needs are being met, they have a sense of place, a sense of past, present, and future. Those are in kind of it.
With the pyramid, it kind of has a little bit of a parallel with Maslow, which is, but part of Maslow's theory is you don't necessarily motivate folks to get to the top level. They have to have that internally driven, and it may not always be present to get folks to that level. I feel about where you are, and will you get by with your 2 part-time or temporary full-times evaporating in the next year? We went to council, and council said, go with a program to transition us. We've done that, and my job is to find a way to maintain that. And it's going to take some additional resources to go back to losing those 2 completely. I don't think will keep us where we need to go, because the proactive work takes time. But it's, from my perspective, the return on the caseload and the quality of the neighborhood goes up dramatically. But the other piece is the administrative piece. Because somebody being there to answer those questions is cheerful, informative, and can say, yeah, we're working on it, rather than leaving code enforcement a message and them coming in at 4 o'clock and trying to get caught up in those things. So I need to figure out that's going to be a challenge, and it's going to need some resources, but I think maybe half the resources is what I'm looking at requesting.
Any other questions? Staff, anyone? John, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming down and spending the time with us. This is fascinating and very interesting. I think it's...
And since I know 2 of your city council members, I'll put in a good word for you.
Thanks. Well, I hate talking about this stuff, as you can tell. So.
Well, I'm envious of your 12 years of having this under your belt, because this is, this is, I think, something that definitely is an enhancement to a community, to be able to offer those types of bridge building that you do.
It's an investment, I think, in, it's like the old pure later oil filter. You pay me now, you pay me later. And I think investing up front can really make a difference in the long term.
Have you seen, real briefly, as the communities are aging, have you seen this have any special effect on helping with senior problems that you have in the community, or senior issues?
Well, I think knowing your neighbor, and so, and I think I talked about this at CML, you know, the neighbors see the rhythms of their neighborhood and of their neighbors. And so if there's a senior and they have certain patterns and certain things that they do, and you're in tune with that, if those change, then yes, I mean, you know, if you feel like it's part of your neighborly duty to check on them, that helps. Again, if you fall and break the hip, what's the best way to take care of those kinds of things? So I would say yes, and actually we work with senior services. They're a sister division and do outreach in the substandard housing team. A lot of those things come up. They may be senior issues, so we do work closely with them as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I did bring some one-pagers also on some of our other community involvement strategies. So these are separate. I'll leave those, and you can them around if you'd like.
Okay, thanks so much, John.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for inviting me.
For dinner. Go ahead to Main Street, that's where the best place.
Okay, we have a couple of announcements.
I just wanted to make council aware, we will have a follow-up on this presentation by our staff in November. We're not quite sure of the date right now, but we'll do that in November. And then you guys can compile all that together and provide any direction you'd like to provide us. And then I received a call today from Hudson Gardens and talked to them. They are undertaking a master plan process, and they're looking for one or two council members who would like to participate in two-hour meetings, probably October and November. I don't have any dates yet, but they were interested if people would like to spend those 4 hours with them on a master planning process for Hudson Gardens. So
Anybody?
Bruce and Jerry raised their hands.
Jerry?
Wendy?
Who?
Bruce?
Okay.
Okay. Thanks. I'll let Rich know, and he'll be in contact with you guys.
Okay, cool.
I will also be joining you for that. Thanks.
I'm handing these out
That's all I have.
because, thank you, Michael, sorry. I think everybody's in my mailbox, so these are, that's okay, no worries.
How many
Okay.
of these we going to get?
They're all different.
This one's Bowles, this one's...
Bulls, Santa Fe, and Santa Fe Mineral to Highlands Ranch in Mississippi to
Is that bold?
Mineral.
You don't want to leave. Okay, sorry.
Okay,
I see that.
that's right, yeah, you do.
To see the one from Broadway.
Okay, we are adjourned if there's no other
Yeah, I'd love to see
business.
one for Broadway.